Good day, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you, and especially to welcome our speaker, Karen Florini, to today's talk on communicating climate change. Karen is Senior Advisor at Climate Central, having also served as their Vice President for Strategic Impact and Programs. She was the Deputy Special Envoy for Climate Change at the US Department of State, attending the historic UN Climate Conference in 2015 in Paris. Previously, Karen was the Managing Director of the International Climate Programme at the Environmental Defence Fund in the US. Thus, she has hands-on experience about communicating climate change to move forward efforts to mitigate it. Karen will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and questions should be entered in the Q&A. I'm delighted to pass the baton on to you, Karen.
David, thank you so much for that introduction and also for inviting me to spend the month of July here at the Oxford Martin School, where it is, in general, the weather is being much nicer, despite the rain, than the nearly 30 degrees Celsius or 100 degree Fahrenheit heat that we've been having in most of my hometown of Washington, D.C. lately. So the topic of communication on climate change is a vast one, and I want to start by saying what I am and I'm not going to be doing in this talk. I will be covering free tools and resources, mostly in the context of informal communications, by which I mean not formal education and not formal advocacy. But a lot of the tools I talk about are going to be, I think, germane to both of those sectors as well. Nor am I going to make any attempt to provide a truly comprehensive approach. For that, I draw your attention to the Oxford Encyclopedia of Climate Change Communication, all 1.27 million words of it in 3 volumes. Instead, I'm going to be sharing these tools, and along the way, I'm going to highlight some recent research about communicating on climate change with audiences around the globe. In fact, let's start with that. In my view, some of the most interesting research of late has been done by a nonprofit organization called Potential Energy. It was founded in 2017 by a gentleman named John Marshall, who had been, until then, working in one of the leading marketing firms in New York. And now I'm going to quote from their website. John's son Henry came home from school and confronted John about wasting his skills selling shampoo and credit cards instead of addressing the biggest problem of our time, climate change. After being locked in his house for 2 days by his son, John created Potential Energy. As origin stories, that strikes me as pretty memorable. The point that I want to make is that Potential Energy uses the same data-based analyses of what works in terms of communications that companies use in figuring out how to spend $500 billion annually in the US on ad buys. I've also shared Potential Energy's origin story for another reason, because of the importance of storytelling in communication. Long before writing was invented, humans communicated through storytelling. We're hardwired to remember stories, much more so than numbers and statistics. And at the same time, stories are stickier if they contain specifics, including numbers. So storytelling is probably not the norm in most academic circles, but for most other kinds of communications, it really is essential in making information memorable. Coming back to Potential Energy's work, they partnered with Yale University in the United States on a study called Later is Too Late. It looked at message efficacy with 60,000 people across 27 countries, representing about 70% of the world's population. And they examined what resonated most with people around the world. They found that there was some uptake of messages about jobs and economic growth, about reducing social inequity. And they found that 5 times more effective were messages about health, and 7 times more effective were protecting ourselves from extreme weather. But by far the big winner, by a factor of 12, was protecting the planet for future generations. And in terms of future generations, they're not speaking of, hundreds and thousands of years into the future, but rather today's kids and tomorrow's kids and the adults that they will become. And that worked across ideologies, including in the United States. Potential Energy's also done another study, or actually a set of studies from which they've drawn some variety of lessons. And the report that they compile these in is called Talk Like a Human. Based on message testing, they again find that the two foundations are still the most important messages. Carbon pollution from fossil fuels stays in the atmosphere, causing the planet to overheat dangerously. And there is complete scientific consensus on this. Other lessons that they draw are make it local. Don't talk about something far away in time or in space. Talk about the here and the now. Tie climate change to its consequences, again, in the here and the now. And talk about making energy 100% clean rather than eliminating an industry such as fossil fuels. They also urge that we avoid wonk speak. Save Florida, in their example, which is one of the states in the US, is much more effective than, quote, get to net zero by 2040. Now, the latter is very useful when you're talking to other members of the climate community. It's succinct and it helps us keep focused on that goal. But when you're talking beyond the people who are already within the climate community, that just doesn't register. Potential Energy also urges avoiding partisan language. Now, that's particularly an issue in the United States, but less so elsewhere. The science-based tools that I'm going to be presenting are intended to help you achieve those kinds of, implement those recommendations. So we're going to be looking at messengers, and then messages, and then briefly at mechanisms. But first, we're going to talk about audiences. Audience influences messenger and message and mechanism alike. Even before we start in on audiences, though, I want to talk about the why. Why talk about climate change? It's because discussing the topic leads to greater acceptance of climate science, the foundation of the issue. In short, we need that foundation because it's a crucial part of building the durable public will that we're going to need in order to do what needs to be done on this extraordinarily complex problem across the years and decades that it will take to get a handle on it. Research does show that talking about it does make a difference in advancing the science, and that talking about it repeatedly matters a lot, including repeating facts over and over and over again. For those of us who do a lot of climate communication, you get to the point where you can hardly stand to say the same thing again, but some of the people you're talking to are hearing the topic or hearing that fact for the first time. At least as important as the why is the who. In any given communication, who is your audience? Sometimes that's fairly straightforward, and sometimes it really isn't. For example, this very talk. The notice was distributed through the Oxford Martin listserv, but has been shared in a number of other places as well. Anyone can register, and it's going to be posted online for future viewing as well. As of a couple of days ago, more than 400 people had registered from a very wide variety of locations and backgrounds. So I've wrestled with the question of who my audience is today, and I've chosen to address people whose work is climate change one way or another, as professionals or as volunteers, and as an important secondary audience. I'm hoping to speak to people who work on not as communicators about climate change, but other aspects of the climate problem, and who may find it helpful to have the broader perspective on climate communication. Being intentional about your principal and your secondary audiences is, in my view, the most important step in planning and crafting any kind of communication. And I tend to be pretty skeptical of when someone says that their intended audience is the general public. There really isn't any such thing as the general public. There are many publics with different backgrounds and different values and different interests in different locations at different stages of their life. So one thing you need to think about is, are you trying to reach folks as voters or constituents? Are you trying to reach them as activists or as potential activists? Are you trying to reach them as consumers? And sometimes it's more than one of these at the same time, but you need to figure out which is your principal focus at any given spot. Even among climate professionals, there are generalists who have a broad understanding of the topic, but not necessarily a detailed one on particular elements, and specialists who have a detailed understanding, but not necessarily the broad overview. And often it can be quite helpful for specialists to hear at least occasionally about the broader perspective. So one very useful place to start is with polling data, specifically germane to your specific audience as you can find. There are innumerable polls on climate, but a couple of resources that are very much worth knowing about. One comes from the UN Development Program in conjunction with Oxford University, and another is from Yale University. The UN report, which was issued just a few months ago, surveyed 73,000 people representing 87% of the world's population. Among other topics, they explored the frequency with which people think about climate change and the extent to which climate change is already influencing major family decisions. So when asked how frequently, over half of the people globally said that they think about it daily or weekly. And these are not people who are specifically within the climate community. 32% said a few times a year, and only 11% said never. But there's a very big variation by country, from Uganda at 62% to the Czech Republic at 16%. I know that this slide isn't particularly easy to see, very small type. It's really up there just so you can see the range that it sort of steadily decreases without any particular big jumps in frequency of thinking from Uganda down to the Czech Republic. I also do want to flag that the United States and the UK are pretty near the bottom of the pack. Another key question that they asked is, how much has climate affected big decisions for your family about where to work or live or what to buy? And more than 2/3 said that climate change is already impacting their big decisions. They also asked about how often people had experienced, whether they had recently experienced extreme weather events. And it turned out that people said the more that they'd been experiencing worse than usual weather, the more likely they were to think about climate change, to worry about it, and to factor into big decisions. That's not a surprise, but it is a confirmation that weather is driving people's perspectives. Another good source of information comes from Yale University in the United States. They collected data from nearly 40,000 Facebook users over age 18 around the globe, and they drew samples in proportion to population and gender and related benchmarks. They again found widespread worry about climate change, particularly though not exclusively among developing countries, I should say. But one of the most notable findings of the report is that many people around the world lack the basic understanding that climate change is caused mostly by human activities. Indeed, it's caused entirely by human activities. If people are worried about a problem but don't understand the fundamental fact that it's human caused, they may not be so willing to support the effective solutions. Yale has also conducted a series of surveys with colleagues at George Mason University. Twice a year since 2008, they've been gathering data using a consistent set of 39 questions on beliefs, on policy preferences, on attitudes and risk understandings and actions and so forth. In addition, they've also done similar surveys in several other countries, including India, Indonesia, and Ireland. From the group of from the group of the American studies, they've been able to crystallize 6 different Americas in terms of people's attitudes: the alarmed, the concerned, the cautious, the disengaged, the doubtful, and the dismissive. And over time, especially over the last decade or so, the alarmed have grown significantly, the concerned have increased, the cautious and the cautious have decreased, disengaged have held pretty steady. These are people who are probably having other kinds of major life crises and have very little attention to spend on anything other than their own day-to-day. The doubtful and the dismissive have both shrunk slightly. And it's the dismissive who make a great deal of the noise, but it is worth keeping in mind that they are a very small fraction of the population, particularly in the US. One of the things that I think responses are downscaled to the county level for the 3,000 counties. Counties are subdivisions of states in the United States. This is very valuable information when doing geographically focused information and geographically focused communications. One interesting finding, I think, is that relatively few places in the US, it looks like there's a lot of the blue, which indicates less than half of the population is concerned about global warming. It looks like there's a lot of blue, but it's mostly in places that are relatively less populated. But as the UNDP Oxford study found worldwide, many people in the US lack this basic understanding that global warming is caused by human activities. All the blue shaded areas in both maps indicate that fewer than half of the population has that basic understanding. This is a pretty fundamental problem in climate communication. One way that the US differs significantly from most of the rest of the world is disparity along the political spectrum. In the US, climate regularly shows up as the single issue with the biggest partisan divide, and that divide has been growing over time. Interestingly, it's because more of the folks in the Democratic Party side, are getting increasingly concerned about climate, while those in the Republican Party side have remained relatively constant at a low level. This graph happens to start in 2009. In earlier years, there were actually closer agreement among the parties at an overall higher level. And in fact, the 2008 Republican nominee for president, John McCain, was the principal sponsor of climate legislation in the US Senate while he served there. Unfortunately, subsequently, the topic has more and more gotten involved and mired in culture war politics. Integrally related to the question of audience is the question of messenger. Who is a trusted and credible source for reaching the relevant audience? If your audience analysis indicates that you are not a credible messenger, you may want to rethink your strategy, either by finding someone who is, or by refocusing your attention on someone for whom you are, in fact, a relevant and credible messenger. Pretending that you are a relevant messenger for someone when you aren't isn't going to be particularly useful. To take an example from another US study, for Democrats, it's climate scientists, environmental groups, and our Environmental Protection Agency who tend to be the most trusted. However, for Republicans, it's quite different. For them, particularly for conservative Republicans, it's family and friends who matter the most. Again, this result is specific to the United States, but it does suggest to me that in instances where folks are not all that inclined to be accepting of climate science, climate concern, family and friends may be the most effective messengers. A related phenomenon is what's called pluralistic ignorance. That's a technical term meaning people's mistaken beliefs about what other people believe. So although nearly 2/3 of Americans are concerned about climate change, they think only 43% are. This turns out to be very consistent among geographies and across ideologies in the US, and I suspect the same is true elsewhere. Peers are often key messengers, and one cohort that, in my view, consistently under-communicates to their peers about climate change is business leaders. Every year, the World Economic Forum surveys business leaders about top risks over the next couple of years and into the future for the next decade. And for 2024, they found that extreme weather events rank as the second highest event risk over the next couple of years, including this year in which there are so many elections going on. And over the next decade, extreme weather events were the top risk. And extreme weather events is exactly what climate change makes worse, a lot worse. Moving from audience to message, depending on your circumstances, in every instance, communication needs to start where the audience is. And sometimes, though by no means always, that means the basics of the science. So here are half dozen points that I think are especially useful. One is the basics of the physical phenomenon. A useful analogy here is the carbon dioxide as a blanket, pointing out that naturally occurring levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere trap some of the sun's incoming energy, while the rest gets bounced back into space. But as more carbon dioxide is loaded into the atmosphere, less of that energy gets bounced back and more of it stays within our atmosphere, heating our planet. The carbon dioxide creates a denser blanket that traps more heat, and temperatures rise. So understanding this basic phenomenon is key because we can't argue with the atmosphere. It does not negotiate, it cannot be bribed, and it always bats last. As I've already noted, another key point is that the main source of carbon dioxide is burning fossil fuels, oil and gas, and most especially coal. Depending on the audience, it may also be worth noting that deforestation and agriculture are important too, but those roles are dwarfed by those of burning fossil fuels. And another point that I think isn't made as often as it should be is that even very small changes in temperature on average lead to big changes in extremes. And it's the extremes that have the big consequences. I worked on climate change for a number of years before I saw this graphic and really got it at a gut level as to why a very small number of changes in average degrees has such a big impact on extremes. Another undercommunicated point is that carbon dioxide sticks around in the atmosphere for many hundreds of years. Apparently, most of the carbon dioxide pollution emitted by early model cars, like the Model T, is still in the atmosphere, warming us today. Finally, it's important to stress that it's clear beyond question that what's going on now is not the result of natural cycles. This is what carbon dioxide levels look like from natural cycles. This is where we are now. There's nothing natural about that. And it's equally clear that carbon dioxide levels are continuing to climb as we continue to burn fossil fuels. Again, depending on your audience, it may be worth noting that carbon dioxide isn't the only heat-trapping gas. While it's by far the most important, there are a handful of others that matter as well. Chief among these is methane, which over a 20-year period is 80 plus times more effective at trapping heat than is carbon dioxide. The main human-caused sources of methane in the atmosphere are oil and gas industry, landfills, and animal agriculture, particularly cow burps. Ratcheting down on methane is thus one of the most important steps that we can take to slow the pace of warming in the near term. I could go on for quite a while about methane, but in the interest of being focused on climate communications, I'm going to stop there on this topic. Moving from the basics of the science to the actual impacts of climate change, I think it's often useful to provide an overview of the sheer range and variety of impacts, depending as always on your particular audience. And the next several slides provide an example of how I like to do so. The most intuitively obvious impact of climate change is heat. 2023 was the hottest year on record, with big chunks of the globe experiencing their hottest ever recorded location. hottest ever temperature recorded in the location. That's what the dark red indicates. And every one of the past 12 months has broken the heat record for that month. Data released just a couple days ago by Europe's Copernicus Climate Service indicates that this is now up to 13 months in a row with June. Indeed, it can often be useful to emphasize that the last 10 years are the 10 hottest global years on record. Stressing the consequences of heat is also useful. Heat kills. It's the leading cause of weather-related deaths in the United States, although that isn't true everywhere. Heat also worsens a wide variety of medical conditions, particularly among seniors, who are physiologically more vulnerable than the adults on average. So are infants. And of course, heat is problematic for the people who work outdoors, like growing most of the world's food and building and repairing most of the world's infrastructure. Not to mention the 2/3 of households that don't have access to air conditioning, or birds and other wildlife who likewise don't ever have access to air conditioning. Higher temperatures also make air more stagnant. It allows pollution to pile up, particularly in cities. And those same higher temperatures cook more smog, which is itself a dangerous air pollutant. Higher temperatures also pull water out of the soil, intensifying drought. World Weather Attribution, which is an initiative of a large consortium of scientists, showed that human-induced climate change made the soil moisture drought much more likely by a factor of at least 20 for the Northern Hemisphere a couple of years ago. And then heat and drought combine to really do a bad number on crops. So high temperatures means that there's more moisture demand. Plants want to pull more moisture from the soil, but the drought means that there isn't as much moisture in the soil. The result is wilted, stunted, and less productive crops. Last week, the Financial Times ran a very nice piece explaining how, as their subheader explains, shifting weather patterns are reducing crop yields, squeezing supplies, and creating what could become a permanent source of inflation. And it's not just drought, it's also fire. The more that the weather is hot and dry and windy, the bigger the fire risk and the longer the fire season. For example, in portions of the US state of Arizona in our Southwest, we've seen the fire season expand by 57 days. That's almost 2 months. We've also seen, with more wildfire smoke, including last year's record levels of wildfire smoke. So fire and drought are by no means the only consequences of extreme heat. More than 90% of the excess heat that's trapped in our planet is actually in the oceans. And hot water is what feeds hurricanes. Note that I'm not saying that hurricanes or cyclones, as they're known beyond the US, is necessarily more frequent. There's some complex atmospheric chemistry that determines whether or not they form and stay formed. But it's clear that the ones that do form and grow get bigger, stronger, faster. As did Hurricane Beryl, which hit the Caribbean last week. For many audiences, it's worth noting that intense storms, like other climate impacts, are most likely to hit the people who have had the least impact, the least contribution to climate pollution, and whose own climate contribution is minimal to minuscule. And unfortunately, oceans right now are making more heat than ever. Oceans are record hot. They're making more and more hurricane food. Even without hurricanes, extreme rainfall leads to floods. And the more heat and the hotter the air, the more water it can hold. And then when rain is triggered, it comes down in a deluge. So we've seen things like the massive floods in southern Brazil a couple months ago, World Weather Attribution did an analysis of this event, finding that human-caused climate change had made the event twice as likely and 6 to 9% more intense than naturally would have been the case. It's also important to remember that impacts don't go away when floodwaters recede. Flooded fields mean loss of crops, loss of ability to transport crops to market. Contaminated water supplies mean spread of illnesses, and all as the devastating floods in Pakistan a couple of years ago made all too evident. Hot water is not only cyclone food or hurricane food, it's also bad for coral reefs. That's what triggers coral bleaching, which often leads to coral death. Reefs and many ocean creatures get a double whammy. It's not just the heat. In addition, the higher levels of carbon dioxide get added to the ocean water, making them more acidic. As a result, that it's harder and harder for the ocean creatures to form their shells, not just the corals, but also many, many other kinds of ocean creatures, including ones that form the base of the marine food chain. That's the food chain that is the basis of primary protein for hundreds of millions of people around the world. It can also be useful to flag that as disasters become more frequent, that by definition means they're happening with fewer days between them. So the vertical axis here is showing the number of days between billion-dollar events. And by the way, yes, $1 billion are inflation adjusted. These are statistics for the United States. Back in the latter part of the 20th century, we had 2 or 3 months on average between billion-dollar disasters. Now it's down to 2 to 3 weeks. As impacts and disasters are closer together, that means there's less and less time for first responders to recover, for aid groups to restock, for governments to be ready to redeploy. And that means that the next disaster has even seeing depleted resources come forward once it occurs. This array of impacts, extreme heat, air pollution, drought, agricultural impacts, wildfires, big cyclones, floods, impacts on oceans, all are occurring increasingly all over the world together. This is why the Secretary General of NATO has said that climate change is a crisis multiplier, and we see the effects all over the world. So climate change also makes every other challenge worse as a result, whether it's economic development, dealing with inequality, improving health, limiting involuntary migration, protecting national security, and protecting biodiversity. One of the other things that it does, even makes it harder for people to vote. Earlier this year, I had the tremendous privilege of doing a residency at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy to do a project that I call Disenfranchised by Climate Change. This looks at the many ways that climate-driven extreme weather can disrupt individuals' fundamental right to cast their vote and have their vote counted. I recently, with my colleague Alice Hill, published an article on this topic for the journal Foreign Affairs. But whoever the audience, they need to know that all is not lost. There are ways to create energy without carbon pollution, such as from the wind and the sun. And these are getting more cheap and more plentiful and more robust as they scale up. So wind and solar and battery costs have plummeted in recent years. They upticked slightly at the end of the pandemic when costs of pretty much everything was upticking. They are starting to come back down again now. Battery costs are also important because they let us store energy for when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. In fact, globally, new solar and onshore wind is cheaper than building new fossil fuel. That's an extraordinary change in circumstances over the last many years. and it's one that many people have not yet internalized. Indeed, over the last couple of years, its investment in solar is now surpassing that for all other energy generation technologies combined. And its clean energy investment overall is nearly double fossil fuel spending. So good news, problem solved, right? Unfortunately, no. And that's because there is a huge stock of existing fossil fuel infrastructure. That's a point that some people have have internalized the word that renewables are cheaper and think that the problem is solved. But that's not the case because of the massive infrastructure that's still out there that uses fossil fuels. And the world isn't building renewables at anything like a pace that's fast enough to displace fossil fuel use the rate that we need to be doing so. And the same is true of other low carbon infrastructure. I'm going to pause for just a moment and give a big shout out to Our World in Data. It's a truly extraordinary resource for climate data across the world, and actually not just climate data, many other key problems as well. It's got emissions data on carbon emissions and other pollution sources by country, across time, on major sector categories, including not just electricity generation, but also industry and transportation and food, and much, much more. I recently learned that Oxford is the home of Our World in Data. It was originally part of the university. So coming back to some important points for key audiences, can be helpful to point out that we are, in fact, in a better place than we were before. In 2015, the nations of the world adopted the Paris Agreement with the aim of keeping global warming to well below 2 degrees. Right now, with current policies that are now in place, we're headed to about 2.5 to 3 degrees. If the nations of the world were to actually fulfill the pledges that they've been making, we'd be down around 2 degrees. But that's still well above 1.5, which is the preferred target under the international agreement. Still, we are much better off than we were before adoption of the Paris Agreement, at which point we were on track for more than 4 degrees, which would have been truly catastrophic. To help show why 1.5 degrees is appropriate target and why that matters, this sequence of charts from the UN Environment Program can be useful. It shows that the actual historical frequency of high heat events back in the last half of the 19th century, in the last half of the 19th century, occurring once every 50 years. Now it's occurring almost 5 times as often. And if we was likely to go into the future and we were to hit 1.5 degrees, then it'd be another doubling of beyond where we are now. At 2 degrees, another 3 times where we are beyond now. And at 4 degrees, it would have been nearly 10 times where we are now. So that is certainly something we want to be avoiding. Coming back to sources of locality-specific information, my organization, Climate Central, is here to help. We provide localized grist for climate communications all over the world, connecting dots between climate change and its impacts and its solutions over and over and over again in order to help build the durable public will that's needed to tackle the problem. We're a climate science research and communications nonprofit. We are policy neutral. We never take positions on particular policies or technologies, although sometimes we do report on technologies in particular. But that's not us advocating for that technology any more than when we report on hurricanes. We are certainly not advocating for hurricanes. We're also strictly nonpartisan. We specialize in producing highly localized tools and visuals on impacts and on solutions, and our material is free. I'm going to briefly mention 3 of our particular programs that I think might be helpful for folks. One is the Climate Matters program. You've been seeing a number of the graphics that we produce one every week and circulate them to about 4,000 people who've asked to receive them from different parts of the climate community. Some of it is media, some of it is civil society, some is business and government and educators. What we share is something that's typically localized to a media market in the United States, which basically means the large cities and their surrounding areas. And so we'll be sending out something at any given week that's germane for that week for the country as a whole. So in July, we are often talking about heat. But it's not just the temperatures that we're showing. We also show precipitation frequently. It's the consequences of them, like worse air quality and more mosquitoes that bear disease and more power outages that are weather related, as well as solutions like more home energy efficiency. It's not just the graphic that's circulated, it's also some key points and the concepts and links on that. I know this isn't going to be terribly legible. I'm just letting you know essentially what the size of the weekly bulletin is. You are more than welcome to sign up. In fact, you are invited to do so. You can do so at climatecentral.org/sign-up, or you can find that link at the bottom page of each page of our website. I want to add a little bit of additional information on solutions. One source that I'm quite fond of is a daily newsletter called Canary Media. Another is a roughly weekly podcast called Volts. The host of Volts, David Roberts, sometimes gets very into politics, but more often is talking about technologies in ways that are very interesting to hear. And then there's a peer-reviewed paper that is a fascinating new, very recent paper by the very same Sir David Hendry, who is serving as our host right now. And I'm hoping that he'll be able to share some details about it during our Q&A. Another tool from Climate Central is our Climate Shift Index. This quantifies the fingerprint of climate change on temperatures everywhere, every day. We developed the index to help people understand that the climate change is affecting how big the impacts of climate change are already occurring now in so many locations around the globe. You can zoom in into the map. It shows a list of set of scale at the top. What we're indicating is how much more or less likely climate change is making a particular temperature at a particular time. You can use the advanced settings to show not just today, but also the average high and the average low, and which matters greatly now that it's getting hot and it's harder and harder to sleep. We are able to use this to do retrospectives as well as to send out alerts when something is forecasted to be hot in a particular location. So we did a retrospective that showed from November 22 to October 23, 73% of the globe's population had at least a month of abnormal heat resulting from climate change, making it at least 3 times more likely. Next month, here's a sneak preview, we're going to be doing the same thing for oceans. Other attribution tools are from the World Weather Group that I've mentioned already, as well as Columbia University's Climate Attribution Database, which collects about nearly 700 scientific resources. Last, I'll mention our coastal risk screening tool, which has a number of different layers. The time horizon is particularly popular. It lets you see what gets wet, where, when, by decade from 2030 all the way up to 2150. And you can change the settings. So you're just looking at sea level rise or an annual or a decadal or a century flood and so forth. Few words on mechanisms. Another very interesting resource that comes from this university is the Reuters Institute Digital News Report to try to help people understand what audiences are paying attention to what outlets. And they often assess this. There's a wealth of information here. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. They often break things out by age group, and they find that for all age groups, the topic of greatest interest is local news, followed by international. And that for 4 of the 5 age groups, environment and climate is also a top 5 issue. This suggests that lots of different kinds of stories about climate change are going to be of interest. They also have about 40 different country-specific assessments of what is being most looked at. And that kind of information is extraordinarily useful if you're trying to target your climate communications. I want to close by mentioning and reinforcing, reminding us all that there is indeed hope, not only because of the growing availability and affordability of solutions, a large and growing number of them, not just wind and solar, those are the ones that I focused on today, but also because there are vast numbers of people with their shoulder to the wheel working to solve the problem. In fact, there's so many governments and businesses and civil society members and that it takes a complex network map just to show the initiatives, not just the groups, but the multi-group initiatives and their connections. This, again, is a project from Oxford University, something called the Future of Climate Cooperation. So today I've tried to provide a practitioner's perspective on some of the why, some of the who, some of the how, and some of the what on climate communication, on audience messengers, messages, and mechanisms. Messages are about protecting what is loved by your audience and by you. Messengers can be any of us, and mechanisms can be anything from mass media to one-to-one communications. I hope you found this information helpful. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karen, for a fascinating talk that covered a vast amount of information. That perhaps the one criticism might be that when you're communicating, you want to limit the amount of information.
Yeah.
But I think
I meant to say at the outset that I will be making a PDF of the slides available, so people will be able to look at it in a more leisurely fashion.
Definitely, yes, indeed. And I think that's right. But I also think that for this audience, the key thing is there will be bits of it that are germane to them and bits that they already know and don't have to take account of. So wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, as I said, it was really quite a challenge to think about how to address such a wide audience. And I might have been better served smaller audiences by narrowing it down a bit.
No, I think given the huge size of the audience, there must be people at all levels of knowledge about climate change and can learn about communication, particularly given the urgency. Later is too late, quite definitely, and it may already be towards the midnight in dealing with it, but we hope that some of the recent huge upsurges we've seen, I mean, a 4-degree rise in the North Sea, July last year, in a month, 4 degrees in the North Sea. I swam in the North Sea as a kid. It was freezing. How did hot water get to the North Sea? The only access is via the Arctic. So it's really quite frightening. And I think lots of people have noticed that insects are much rarer than they have been 25, 30 years ago. And that's, again, very worrying for the future of the planet.
Shall we go to questions?
Yes, we can go to questions. Clara, you can take us so I can see where questions are.
Hi, David. They're just on the right-hand side in the speech bubble with the question mark.
Right. These resources look really useful. Can you please share links to access them? Oh, yes, you'll be sharing links to access them.
Some of them are direct links. The others, you'll be able to see the name quite clearly from the PDF, and they'll be easy to find.
Right. Are Ugandans more climate change conscious because they experience greater extremes already? And how do you get change when that's already going on?
That is a truly excellent question. I think that that Ugandans probably are experiencing greater extremes in the weather. And in much of the world, Mother Nature is solving the problem for us, that we are seeing extreme weather events happening in more and more places and more locations all the time. That is also, as I mentioned, the reason that we created the Climate Shift Index, in order to help people see the connections between what they're feeling, people don't experience average global temperatures, they experience weather. And what is really important, I think, is to make sure that we are connecting those weather impacts to the underlying phenomenon of climate change and the use of fossil fuels.
Okay, you talked about making your own talk based on your audience. Can you give an overview of how you might adapt the messaging about climate science and impacts depending on a couple of example audiences?
Well, that's an excellent question again. I think I need to leave it to the listeners to decide who their audiences are, for whom they are the credible messengers, and then to think about which are the pieces of this kind of information that they need to know. I do believe it's generally useful to give people a grounding in the science, so that they sort of don't get whipsawed by various pieces of misinformation floating about. But other than that, it's partly, what's their attention span? What are they really interested in? How do you connect what they care about, what they love, to the particular impacts that climate change is likely to be happening in their location?
Okay, can I add to that we do quite a bit of that from Climate Econometrics, particularly when we were a bigger group holding events for school children. And school children love playing with things. So having levers that show you what happens if you do this, or having balloons that get bigger as the amount of CO2 gets pumped into them, to illustrate what's happening in the climate. So you can certainly adjust it.
Yeah, and as I said at the outset, I was not intending to focus on formal education for school children. That's a hugely important topic. It's not one where I have any particular expertise.
It's just a day's festival, science festival in Oxford, in which Jenny, I, Luke Jackson all participated in giving examples of what to do. We agree that small changes in global temperature cause big changes in extremes. How would you explain that on radio?
That is a really good question that I haven't previously considered. You might try just saying that, think of two bell curves overlapping, but that is one where I think the visual is extraordinarily helpful. Or just verbally saying a small shift in average, you end up with a big shift in the extremes. It's not as impactful without the visual, though. If somebody does come up with a good explanation for how to do it on radio, please share that.
Okay, I once participated in a program on TV about the UK's national debt, and was trying to explain, because they wouldn't use graphics from me, exactly what had happened historically. And I have to say, it was extremely difficult to persuade people that the ratio of national debt to national income in Britain has twice been 2.5 times. And at the point I was speaking, it was half. And trying to get that across a graph is wonderful, but they weren't available.
Yeah, humans are visual entities for the most part, which is why I think that visuals are in fact so important.
Yes, vested interests in the oil and gas companies try to divide people by putting the blame on them rather than the industry. How would one actually give a good explanation to people that they shouldn't feel guilty about what they're doing, but they should make every effort to try and do something better?
Again, another excellent question. It's clear that what's needed is systemic change. Individual actions by themselves are not going to end up making a big enough difference. I do think that making people recognize that there are things that they can do as consumers that will, and as voters, that will end up having impact in the aggregate is actually worth doing, not to make people feel guilty, but to help them feel empowered. I also agree that there has been some degree of intention to divert from systemic change to individual action, which is why I think it's so important to keep stressing that what's needed is overall action, systemic action, changes in approaches, changes in systems and policies, not just changes in what kind of light bulbs people buy.
Right. Don't talk to the young about climate change because it just creates eco-anxiety. Surely this is wrong, and we should take action to explain, to raise their confidence and reduce anxiety. Is there a degree of excuses going on?
Well, certainly I think young people need to be talked to about climate change. I just don't agree that, I don't think you're doing any service to young people to not tell them about a real problem that's in the world that will in fact affect them. And again, you need to involve them in ways that they can take action, whether it's by reaching out to their elected representatives, whether it is by helping influence the family to perhaps make some lower carbon decisions in their diet or in their selection of their next car, and so forth. But just saying we're not going to talk about it because it causes anxiety is doing them no favors. It's just a lie.
And they do have tremendous anxiety. You see that in the young demonstrating all around Europe, at least, against climate change, against oil and gas, against fossil fuels. So I think the young are well aware and quite capable of seeing that if we can deal with it, they won't be anxious.
Yeah, the way to treat the anxiety is to solve the problem, not to pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yep. The issues at stake are difficult. For example, countries suddenly discover they've got large oil deposits, and naturally for that country, they want to exploit it. How do we persuade them not to?
It is fortunate that wind and solar are now coming down so dramatically in price. 10 and 15 years ago, this would have been a much, much more difficult question, particularly as countries are looking to build up their own energy the energy infrastructure to supply their own needs. There are tough arguments that have to be made about how international finance is being spent from developed countries to developing countries in terms of what is being supported. Is it being clean energy development or not so clean energy development? That's not going to be necessarily an easy discussion. The strategic metals does tend to be an easier discussion because many of those metals are actually needed in the clean energy transition. I think it's also crucial to keep in mind that most of the people who are going to be hit hardest by climate change are the people in developing countries, by virtue of the fact that those countries have fewer resources to invest in resilience. So let's, one analogy, I don't know if this works outside of the United States, but one analogy is sometimes don't cut off your nose to spite your face.
Yep.
Making climate change worse is only going to worsen problems for those very populations.
Would it help to talk about the carbon budget rather than the time to reach net zero?
I think that, again, is something that works very well within the climate community, but less well. It just gets kind of complicated, I think, in my experience. We've tried, and it hasn't gotten a lot of uptake.
Right, I agree. So can I interject with a question before we end? What, in your view, is the very best example of climate communication that you've come across?
I think that's an unanswerable question, because it's not the best. It's the best for a particular audience. So I'm going to give a couple different answers for a couple of different audiences. One of them, for example, is Raleigh Williams has a wonderful set of videos called Climate Town. They are irreverent, snarky, sometimes even profane, but quite effective in getting, and he'll have a short bit up front and then a longer exegesis or a longer explanation. So that's a really effective for younger audiences in particular. For folks for whom that might not go over so well, there's a program called C Change Communications, which is the letter C-change. It was founded by folks who live in Princeton, New Jersey, who thought there needed to be a particular way to reach out to folks in garden clubs and so forth, who were in the more conservative side of the political spectrum in the United States, and who were somewhat resistant to the climate issue. So that's another, I think, extraordinarily effective one. It's not very large scale, but it's very effective with that intended audience. And I also, I don't want to plug my own organization, but I think we actually do a pretty good job of providing the tools and information for other storytellers and climate communicators to use in reaching the audiences for whom they are the most effective and credible sources.
Great. Many thanks, Karen. Wonderful talk. I hope the audience has learned quite a bit and have benefited from it, and you should be able to sign up to the Climate Central newsletter anytime you like. You can also log into the Climate Econometrics website in Oxford if you want to see a more technical approach, where we've also tried to give a strategic pathway that takes account of the interactions between the different sectors like energy generation, transport, manufacturing, agriculture, and waste, etc.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your attention today.
Thanks again.